So we will start with US elections, then we will switch to, after 20-30 minutes, we will talk Middle East and Israel and Palestine and Iran, etc. Then we will do Ukraine and fourth part, anything else. So just be mind, if you would like to ask questions, US elections, now 20-30 minutes, I will just open with first kickoff question, and it's free for newcomers, absolutely free. Ask your questions, have your comments, whatever. So let's not prolong it more. Let's start our evening. Let's do US elections, Israel and Ukraine. And
Take one.
Take one. And we have great friends here. We have Joe Scannell, Executive Vice President of Hudson Institute, Peter Raff, Director of Europe Center, who was doing plenty of campaigning last for Nikki Haley, before that for guys from Florida, guys from Texas, if I'm not mistaken. And we got a lot of conversation about elections, not only about feelings. Yes, guys are bipartisans, not Republican, but they are able to...
Bipartisan Republican.
Bipartisan Republican. I call them normal Republican. The guys know that 3 weeks ago we got MAGA Republicans here, Adrian Zuckerman and others. So let me start with the first question. And I don't want you to ask me who will win the elections. I suppose that there will be a lot of people who will ask who will win the elections. And the guys got meetings at Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Prague Castle today, and everybody was asking them about who will win the election. The question is different. So we are now, I think, exactly 2.5 weeks till election night. What's the dynamics? Here in Europe, we see a lot of Elon Musk. We see Trump at McDonald's. We don't see much of Kamala, honestly. So I know. The last night it was Eminem for Kamala Harris. That was like big stuff. So what's the dynamics? Yes, I know that most of the states it's done deal. Everything is focusing on Pennsylvania and a few others. But how you see the dynamics? You think that yes, we don't know how people will vote, because we will see it on hopefully very soon after midnight. But is it done, or there is still time for big battle to come?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having us, Jan. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to your partnership with us. And I'll just begin before kicking to Joel, who was my boss in the White House of the George W. Bush administration.
Yeah, both guys served with President Bush.
I was here. Joel was up here. So
no, I think I know your CV, so you are both up there.
All right, we'll take it. I'll just say 2 points to Jan's question. The first is I think the election pits an issue advantage that Donald Trump has more or less across the board on the economy, on immigration, on law and order, so inflation, the southern border, crime in urban areas. All of those areas, all of the data shows in each of those, Donald Trump is far ahead. There might be one issue where the Democrats think that they can score points against the Republicans. That's on the matter of abortion. But by and large, I think Trump has a huge edge on the issues. Where I think he was thrown off a bit and where the Democrats might have a slight edge is a personality test. So for years, Donald Trump was setting up a fight with Joe Biden, and he had dragged Joe Biden down. But millions of Americans want to move past the era of Biden and Trump. And so Kamala Harris represents something new. And the risk that I think Trump had when Joe Biden dropped out was that a lot of independent voters would look at this race and say, well, she's not Donald Trump, so I'll vote for Kamala Harris. However, every day that goes by, she grows weaker. She becomes more part of the political slums, so to speak. She's dragged into the race, and she's growing weaker as a result. The second point I would make to the question about the dynamic itself is that some campaigns have wonderful candidates, think Bill Clinton, and they can drag a weak apparatus across the finish line. So the campaign is weaker than the candidate. In 2016, Donald Trump was an excellent candidate with a half-baked campaign, whereas Hillary Clinton was like a carcass, which a sophisticated campaign team was trying to drag across the finish line. Kamala Harris is a very, very bad and mediocre candidate. And I mean that analytically. It's not a normative judgment. I think everyone...
Why?
Well, everyone 8 weeks ago in Washington agreed that she was a total joke. She's not read into a lot of issue sets. She has a losing personality. She ran in 2019, 2020 and was blown out in the Democratic primary. She has major staff turnover. Joe Biden, by contrast, at least has some expertise in certain areas. Like he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He thinks he knows those areas. You chuckle, but
I'm reminded of a line by a writer long ago about Joe Biden that people mistake seniority for gravitas, which he's been around for a long time. I don't think he actually knew that much about any of these things.
But he can speak a little bit to those topics. Kamala Harris cannot. There are people in the White House who would eat lava for Joe Biden. I don't see that with Kamala Harris. So she doesn't have the loyal team he does. And so when you have a setup where Donald Trump is hitting his stride, the McDonald's campaign event you mentioned, some other things that have broken his way of late, the natural answer for a campaign manager on the other campaign is to put your candidate out. But when she has gone out, and I remember Joel and I exchanged texts about this, these interviews have hurt her because she's just not good in front of the camera. So I just think that Trump has sort of, as one Republican operative put it to me, landed the plane beautifully. Just as early voting starting in the U.S., he's picking up steam. I'm smiling because I'm thinking about on election night when Kamala Harris wins, you're all going to think back on this podcast. But, you know, while she's really...
It's through this.
Right, that's right.
If they think that it's because she stole the election.
Well, while she's really kind of struggling to hang on. So I think it's tight, but I feel momentum on Trump's side. And if I had to predict, I'd say that he wins. One other point I would make is everyone focuses on the presidential. I think we're all in agreement that the Republicans take the Senate. And I think Democrats will tell you that on background and private. And then the House probably depends upon how the White House goes, and we'll see from there. But go ahead and fill out the gaps.
Leave any gaps. I agree. I mean, I'm one of those people who 3 weeks ago would have said Kamala Harris has the advantage because of the apparatus that Peter described. I think the Democratic Party is just better at getting out the vote. They have better voter identification. They have, certain key appeals. I think the momentum is clearly with Donald Trump at this point. If you look at snapshots of polling from 2016, 2020, this year, on a specific date. In the past, Hillary Clinton was up by a certain percent, by often 4 or 5% in key states. Joe Biden, same, sometimes more in this race across very key states in what will decide this election. Donald Trump is up by a tiny bit, but that's a huge swing in terms of the actual polling numbers. And if Trump performs better than the polls as he has in the past, this could be actually a big election for him. I think I don't agree with my colleague Mike that it's going to be a landslide, but I think it could certainly be an election for him. On the point about Harris being sort of an empty vessel, I mean, I think to Peter's point, I think her polling was something like 28% approval rating in July, right before Biden got out of the race, and then suddenly it spiked. She hasn't changed. It's just that Democrats decided she was the person. And frankly, if they were excited about her, they would have thrown Biden over the side a long time ago, because it was clear that he was not a good candidate, that he was senile, that he was not ready to be or continue to be president of the United States. The Democratic theory of the race, I think, is the same as it was in 2020. Just don't beat Donald Trump. I mean, Joe Biden won the Democratic primary because he was not Bernie Sanders, who, for those of you who don't follow politics closely, is a socialist senator from Vermont, 80-year-old socialist senator from Vermont. He then won the general election by being not Donald Trump. He never left his basement in Delaware to campaign. And I think they thought the same dynamic would play out this time around. But they have a candidate who's not Joe Biden, sort of making the normal appeal, and one in Harris, who actually has a record of being sort of far to the left of the progressive side of American politics, and now is trying to change those positions, is sort of unlikable on a personal level. It's personal judgment, obviously, not an analytical one, but I think she's having a hard time in the current environment. The one caution that I put on what Peter said about the issue set, we've had some pollsters come into Hudson to talk about issues other than the election, actually, sort of American views on Ukraine and things like that. But one of the issues they've talked about in the last presidential election and in the midterm elections, if you just ask Americans if they're satisfied with the economy, if they're satisfied with the direction of the country, or they think immigration's and they're going in the right direction, all these things that are kind of top tier issues, across the board, they say things are bad, current guy's no good. But Republicans have failed to seal the deal in those previous elections. And the question is why? And part of it is that voters seem to not see, they get it when Republicans say things are bad, they agree, but then Republicans don't say, here's what we're going to do differently. And so it's one thing to say the current guys are bad, to go into the voting booth and pull the trigger for the other guy or the other party is for some reason something that has not translated exactly in terms of numbers. So we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, you can't beat something with nothing. And so we'll see if that, in this case, you can't beat nothing with nothing, maybe. But but we'll see if that is a factor in this election or not.
Please ask questions. First one, Mikhail, whoever, just raise your hands, yeah?
I have two questions. The first one comes with the Kamala Harris. I would like to ask you how big of a problem is legitimacy, because she dropped out of the race in 2019. She never got enough money. She never got enough support. So, and I see it's the same problem now, because like in the end, she was the only one who got left and who could get the nomination. And the second one, when you talked about the polls, I would say, and I would like to ask you how big of a factor is going to be the shy Trump voter, which was the factor when it showed you that Hillary and Biden were both 5% up in the key swing states, and nowadays Kamala is 1 or 2% up. I think like even like 8 years after Trump has entered into politics, this factor is, in my opinion, non-existent.
Yeah.
So these are the two things.
First of all, my wife is from Nebraska, so if we don't get a picture together before that, in trouble. On the question of I think there still is a shy Trump support, not measured in the polls. I don't know if it's as big as in the past, and so, but it may not have to be. So if it's within 2% in Pennsylvania and he's performing 3% better than the past, that makes a huge difference. As to her legitimacy, I agree, but it just hasn't been an issue in this campaign. I mean, she did not win a single primary vote in 2020 when she ran, and yet is now the anointed nominee of the Democratic Party. But it hasn't been a big issue in the campaign.
I'm from the neighboring state of Iowa, and the biggest rival for Iowa is Nebraska, so we should not get a vote. On the polling, you know, people only remember the polling mistakes that actually broke elections. So in 2016, it was supposed to be Hillary Clinton and Trump won. But in 2012, the pollsters had Obama ahead slightly, and he ended up blowing out Mitt Romney. So, you know, it can bend also in the Democratic direction. But I do think this almost cliche of a shy Trump voter, there's probably something to it, because since he's been in the arena, he has outperformed polling. And if he's right there on election day, all the Trump people tell me that they think it's a good sign. He's probably significantly ahead. As to her legitimacy, you know, in 2008, Joe Biden ran in Iowa, the caucus state, couldn't get out of Iowa, lost badly, then was selected as vice president. And 12 years later, in 2020, he didn't cruise to the nomination, but clearly it was the vice presidential imprimatur that got him the nomination. So, you know, that gives Kamala Harris some hope that she was an awful candidate in 2019, 2020, but she now has, you know, the vice presidency as something to kind of strengthen her and to run in 2024. The one difference is that, like, she didn't do what Joe Biden did. Joe Biden in 2019, 2020 ran and won the primary. He had to get through disastrous performances in Iowa and New Hampshire to get to South Carolina, and then showed that he had strength with African-American voters, which really is a core constituency for the Democrats, and that put him over the top. Kamala Harris just inherited the mantle for Joe Biden. And I guarantee if she loses the next day, the White House, the president's team will be leaking that it's her fault. And her team will be leaking that it's the president's fault, that he should have dropped out earlier and should have been a competitive. I mean, there will be, no matter which side loses, this is an eminently winnable election for Republicans and for Democrats. And whoever loses is going to be pissed, and there's going to be an internal, you know, battle about it.
Ambassador.
I'm the Turkish ambassador here. For the first time, we are witnessing assassination attempts in U.S. political campaigns. How serious is this? How much effect did it have? I feel it did. And is this a warning of any sort? How should we read this? I mean, you're supposed to be the example for democratic institutions, and for the first time we've seen blood.
First time since 68.
Well, Reagan was shot.
Reagan was shot.
1981. We had RFK, JFK.
But still, it's 40 years, man. You know,
Yeah.
You know, I think Ambassador has a point.
No, but it's not. I think there's probably a certain polarization in American society, which doesn't suggest mass violence, but I think there is to our system a quality where you can have lone. Like what worries me after the election, no matter who loses, is not some mass event. It's more that, you know, there could be a person here or there who's so seized by the moment that they take bad decisions. But I still think our democracy is basically healthy.
So it's like anomaly for you. These assassinations, it's like anomaly.
Well, I mean, there's been two against Trump
Yeah.
in the span of, you know, a few weeks, but I still think that, I mean, I don't think that we're on the cusp of like disintegration as a country, but that doesn't say there can't be somebody like this guy on the roof in Pennsylvania that's taking a shot at somebody like Donald Trump. I just don't think that the very kind of hyper polarized online politics necessarily reflects like a breaking apart of the country. There are millions of Americans who don't define themselves as Americans by kind of political riveting debates moment to moment. But, you know, that's just
I
instinct.
think the guy in Pennsylvania, as far as we can tell, was not necessarily politically motivated in the way we traditionally think about that, sort of super anti-Trump or pro-Harris or whatever. I mean, interestingly, the most partisan case of an assassination attempt in the last number of years was at a congressional baseball game where a Democratic supporter opened fire on a Republican congressman and almost killed one of them. But I mean, I think that to Peter's point, the polarization is real. And there may be protests and other things after the election, but the sense that America is ready to break out into political.
Like California wants
I
to
think is
secede
overstated.
from the union,
Right.
no matter how this election goes.
Yeah, but
Hollywood,
yeah, jokes aside, if I would basically sort of reformulate Ambassador's question, let's not talk about assassination, but basically transition of power. So you have 3 dates ahead of you. There is election night, and there's 6th of January, and then 20th. Everything will go smooth, or you know, it was quite disastrous last time.
I think there'll be a peaceful transfer of power. That's all.
There will be.
Yeah. Which is like there was last time. Like on election day, Joe Biden took the oath of office. Like I wasn't on January 6th. I wasn't like monitoring Fort Liberty, Fort Bragg to see what the Marines would do.
Yeah.
You know, like I never thought that like the country was in the balance. Like, and that'll be the same this time. If Joe Biden wins, there will be parts of the Republican coalition who will be frustrated, and there will be charges online.
So who's going to win?
Kamala Harris.
Especially if Joe Biden.
Yeah, then it really will have to win. Or if Donald Trump wins, there will be Democrats who will be outraged by it. But like, I don't have any doubt that, you know, the Supreme Court Chief Justice will swear in the next president on January 20th. And I think it'll be much harder for there to be another January 6th style event because like there will be preparations made for that.
Yeah.
I mean, there will be security in place like there wasn't, you know, last go around.
I'll just add, well, I don't necessarily think there's going to be mass political violence. I don't see this as a shining moment for American democracy over the last, 12 years as that, but I agree with everything else Peter said.
Before I will give a floor to Vasil, you are drinking white or red? Red. Toby, do you see the mugs behind you? So I want a red one and red wine, and he will have a blue one, also red wine. Vasil, ask the question.
So my question is, obviously, elections are influenced primarily by domestic issues. But I want to ask, are there any international issues that are important for U.S. voters and which will differentiate between Kamala and Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think that foreign policy is probably a liability for the Biden-Harris team, in large part because Americans look at the world and they see 2 wars that have broken out in the Near East and in Eastern Europe that were not in kind of flames.
Yeah, he has a he has a blue one, man.
This tastes particularly delicious.
So, but Mike, drink your wine.
Yeah. So I don't, you know, so I think, you know, you could make like there are Democrats in Washington or analysts or journalists who will say, or tacticians in the White House and clever foreign policy theorists. And of course, they're superior to the rather kind of brutish Trumpian style of diplomacy. But the average American sees the collapse of deterrence in Israel and the collapse of deterrence in Ukraine and says this group has basically failed. So I think it's, well, and which is a huge black mark on the Biden team, although it hasn't gotten as much play as I would have thought. But the images of the C-17s, you know, are just terrible for him.
I think the way foreign policy tends to play, short of U.S. being actively involved in a war, is kind of in the creating a sense of discord. So this colleague like Duran, brilliant political analyst, was saying earlier today, Trump has played on the idea that there were the U.S. was either pulling out of, but no major wars started on his watch, and whether that's because of his policies or not, there's a sense that things were different, that were more peaceful. You know, that the U.S. was not sending money and weapons to Ukraine to fight off a Russian aggressor. So I don't think many American voters are making their decision based on how they think the U.S. president is going to get along with Europe, but they sort of have a sense of whether the world is in a better position or a worse position because of the current administration.
Which was Reagan's famous line.
Yeah.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Question? Anyone? Okay, so Mattfield first, Egeman second.
No, just British Ambassador. Thanks again. It's super helpful. Just anything about what you're saying about the way the election campaign is being run that will tell us about what the transition and then the team around Trump would look like, as in who has sort of influence and who has his ear, and therefore is likely to see that sort of transition. 2016 in some ways caught everyone by surprise. But what, how
Nikki,
did that-
Nikki, am I right?
I think one moment that for me was where my antenna went up is President Trump has had one major foreign policy meeting on the campaign. It was with President Zelensky a week or two ago. And the one person at his side was Rick Grinnell for that meeting. That was his foreign policy consigliere during that meeting. And
Germans are loving this.
That's and he could have had presumably any number of people, with him during that meeting, and he chose Rick Grinnell. So I think Grinnell is right there. Other than that, nothing from the campaign has told me anything about who's going to be at his side, with the obvious exception of he made a vice presidential pick. But the other names that have been in circulation for months, which are familiar to everyone, the campaign has had no bearing on the rise or fall of any of them, as far as I can tell.
I think that's right. And I think this is actually a point you made that Trump himself likes tension within his advisors and cabinet. He likes tension, period, in every aspect of his life and everyone else's that he interacts with. But he's likely to assemble a team that has tension within it. I don't think you're going to find, just a MAGA view of U.S. role in the world, or just certainly not a globalist, but you're going to find
A team of
more
rivals.
conservative. Yes.
Robert O'Brien.
Robert O'Brien, Senator
Kellogg.
Hagerty,
Hagerty.
Keith Kellogg. I mean, these are all
Marco
people
Rubio.
Marco
Marco
Rubio,
Rubio.
Mike Pompeo, Senator Cotton. I mean, these are people that at least in the Hudson part of this room, we might not agree with on every issue, but we feel like we can have an intelligent conversation with. We know well, we sort of work with them on issues. So my sense is the domestic side was where you may have more of the Stephen Miller sort of hardcore MAGA types, but that's just a guess.
Even J.D. Vance said during his convention speech that it's a big tent on national security. And my theory of Trump is that he never lets the party get too far out of balance. He wants all of the coalition involved, and so he'll have all aspects of it represented. And in the end, he'll be the decider. So much like during the supplemental on Ukraine, the $60 billion that Speaker Johnson eventually put on the floor, Trump held back. Don Jr. was aggressively tweeting against it, and everyone took that as an indicator for his father. But instead, the president kind of stood back, and then in the end, he kind of
Met with
greenlit.
the speaker.
Met with the speaker.
Blessed it,
Yeah,
essentially.
gave him the benediction, the holy benediction, and then it made it to the floor and it passed. So I don't know.
Any family member in official position?
No.
I don't think
No?
it'd be very hard in a confirmed position. Definitely no.
Return to Camelot if so.
Actually, Matt asked my question, but just to follow up, we know it's very human for President Trump to feel betrayed. Mike Pence left him out dry. Senator
I think Mike Pence has a different version of that.
Senator Flake supported Democrats.
Yes.
Liz Cheney is now supporting Democrats. Will he choose his team based on loyalty
Yes.
or knowledge, experience? I mean, are we going to see the top tier Republicans in the administration or the B team?
Well, but that suggests
They're
that
not, they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that the only people loyal to Trump are people that are B teamers. We just listed some names who I think are within the Trumpian family who are capable on foreign policy. And I generally find this critique of Trump sort of perplexing, as if Barack Obama or any other president, Bill Clinton, was like, let me find disloyal members of my party who I can pick in my cabinet. Like, yeah, of course you want a cohesive team. One of the defining qualities and strengths that I just listed earlier that differentiate Joe Biden from the disastrous Kamala Harris vice presidency is their names, which virtually nobody in Europe knows, like Mike Donnell and Steve Ricchetti. Has anyone heard of these people? They are loyal behind-the-scenes staffers who've been with him for decades. Ron Clay, and they have served him well, even if the administration hasn't gone necessarily all that great. But I think a loyal team around him is something that you'd want to emulate versus Harris, who has had a revolving door of people coming in and out, to whom she has shown little loyalty and who have had little for her. So if he goes that route, I think having loyalty would probably be a good quality for a president.
There's also, I mean, prior to Donald Trump, who came in with essentially no party around him. I mean, every president, Republican or Democrat, before you get a job in that administration, you have to be registered in the party. You have to have participated in the election. You have to have volunteered for the campaign. So these are low-level measures of loyalty, but it's not like this is a new thing in American politics. And for good reason. You're trusting people with very important decisions, and you want to know that the policies you are trying to get through are ones that they're going to support.
And the press is calling daily.
Yeah.
And, so anyways.
Nebraska again.
I have a question. The 2016 elections were decided based on the FBI leaks, James Comey and the emails and everything. Similar thing happened now when we learned that one of the senior officials has leaked information about the potential attack on Iran by the Foreign Office. I want to ask if this is going to play any sort of impact in the elections, or it's going to swept away under rug within 2 weeks.
I mean, my guess is swept away because it's American media, which is largely Democratic in their, you know, who they support, and increasingly anti-Israel in their coverage also. But that's a cynical take. But
Yeah, I don't think it lasts. I don't even think we have a news cycle anymore. Like media has just changed, and so I would be surprised if that story won't. It hasn't even clung on till now. And at some point in the next week, the Israelis will probably wipe it away too, because we'll be focused more on the actual response and other things. So I don't know, but that might be a good transition to the Israel discussion because
Vasil, and
Yes,
if
sir.
anyone, so Vasil now question, and if anyone last question on U.S. elections, then ask, and then we move to Israel. So Vasil,
don't ask me who I voted for because I won't tell you.
I think we know.
Looks like I'm competing with ambassador. I will ask one question, but no, my question is: if Trump wins, what can we Europeans expect? Policies and Europe.
Utopia.
Well, I mean, this is part of Trumpism, is that he likes to keep everyone guessing, without knowing in particular. And I do think there are some aspects to Europe that make it easier to do policy than it is, say, in the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific. And that is that we have an existing multilateral framework that eases entry into the region in NATO. And then beyond that, I think there's probably going to be tension on the economic and trade front. I don't know if he'll go for tariffs, but it looks like he might, with a lot of exemptions. But that will immediately raise the temperature. There's a steel issue on the horizon. And on Ukraine, I really don't know what he's going to do. I have a sneaking suspicion that they'll try to figure out some sort of funding vehicle, if they can, during the lame duck session to give the president more time, whoever it is, Harris or Trump. But in particular, if it's Trump, to give them time for a Ukraine review. And then if he wants to try to go for negotiations, my hope would be that the Ukrainians position the Russians as the problematic actor so that Trump swings in behind the Ukrainians to pressure the Russians. Because you have to remember, the Russians have annexed now 5 oblasts of Ukraine, only one of which, Crimea, they fully control. So can Putin really accept the other 4 not entirely in his hands, not to mention the Ukrainian position in Kursk? If he comes across as obstreperous, which would be my goal on the outside to try to position the Russians that way, then maybe Trump, in a frustration, will back the Ukrainians, including taking off some of the restrictions for targeting inside the Russian Federation. As a general matter, I just think that Trump opens the policy aperture a little bit, to put it kind of in a sanguine, optimistic sense. Criticism would be that it's erratic, but he would just open up the options more. And with Harris, I expect more continuity and more kind of Biden or Obama 4.0, Biden 2.0, and that would be more assistance to Ukraine, but never really empowering them to go for victory, never allowing them to kind of fall for defeat either, just this perpetual warfare that bleeds them out white. So that's kind of on, those are kind of some of the big features. And then we have big questions ahead of us on our force posture and NATO. We just agreed in Madrid to a strategic concept, in Vilnius to a new family of plans, and in Washington we focused on implementation of NATO. So all right, we have new plans. Our country's actually meeting the obligations within those plans. What if we have snap inspections? What if we have kind of rapid assessments of our ability to respond on the Baltic contingency? Republicans will be very focused on that hard power element, probably a little bit more than Democrats would. But Ukraine is one area that worries me, because I'm very hawkish on Ukraine, and I don't know where Trump is on that necessarily.
I think that's right. And I think you separate Ukraine as an issue maybe, and I'm not sure how it goes with that. But I think with U.S. European issues beyond that, his first term will probably be indicative. He'll always want to be unpredictable. He'll always want to create leverage. But I think, tariffs, I think Boeing, Airbus competition, I think, all of the energy, all of the things that military spending that were issues in his first term are likely to be, again,
Germany, Central Eastern Europe. Harris on the German. I think
yeah.
the Biden-Harris team thinks Europe is Berlin and Brussels.
Yes,
And that's,
Gordon, especially.
and that's how they will run Europe policy. The Trump team is much more attracted, or the Republicans, to Central and Eastern Europe, to Prague, also Budapest, but Warsaw, Ankara. I think there's a real opportunity to work through the Central and Eastern Europeans to recognize that Turkey has probably the biggest military in Europe at this point, a fighting force, which I think Democrats kind of dismiss. So that kind of stuff I do think might make a
And
difference.
essentially, I think Trump actually, I think the soft
Special relationship.
okay, and the special
Yeah, great golf
relationship.
courses. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
So thank you. U.S. elections done. Mike, don't run away. Don't run away. Yeah, definitely more coffee. So thanks, Joel. Thanks, Peter. It was great. Thanks. So Mike went for more coffee to his Kamala mug. Hopefully it tastes good. So now we are switching from U.S. elections to Middle East. We have Mike Doran, who served at the U.S. Department of Defense. Then he served National Security Council. He was coordinating State Department on multiple issues. Guys, don't squeak there. It's Peter. It's Americans, of course. So Mike Doran now, I would say every week, literally on Fox News, ABC, is running Middle Eastern Department at Hudson Institute. Zinet Ribua, she is running Israeli Arab topic at Hudson. China involvement in Middle East, also Maghreb, Northern Africa. She's from Georgetown, Harvard. So my first question is for you, Mike, because, you know, U.S. elections now all the time here. Israel is so fast moving spiel, unlike Trump, Harris, Trump, because, you know, we got pager situation, walkie-talkie situation, Hassan Nasrallah bunker, Yahya Sinwar now yesterday, super funny IDF spokesperson talking about there is a gold. So it's 1 year since 7th October. And how I perceive it is that Israelis are having great time and great fun. If you look, like, you know, how, you know, if
I've never heard anyone say that.
you know, because, you know,
Yeah.
it's so, like pagers, like
Yeah.
this is like it's like bad spy movie. It's not good spy movie. It's not James Bond. It's like, you know, 5,000 pagers, like boom, you know, in your pants, literally.
Yeah.
And then walkie-talkie, and then they kill big guy from Hezbollah, and second guy, and the guy who just was voted for the because, you know, also like. How you see the situation, you know, because before always Big Brother from Washington was running the everything in Middle East. Now Israelis are very independent, very active. How you see the situation?
Okay.
1 year after 7th October.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I just have to express one disappointment. I'm really surprised that me, the Turkish ambassador, and the British ambassador are the only ones wearing ties. I'm a little disappointed. but I would like to thank you two for that. The Israelis are under pressure from the Americans. Actually, great pressure. They have in the last month or two, they have changed the balance of power with Iran. I think it's very important to get the framing right. The Biden administration is framing the conflict as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Much of Europe is framing it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's actually an Israeli-Iranian conflict. I would actually say it's an Iranian-American conflict, but let's forget about that. It's clearly an Israeli-Iranian conflict. And in the last few months, they have changed the balance of power because they decapitated Hezbollah, they've decapitated Hamas, they have threatened Iran militarily. But Iran still has very significant capabilities, which it showed in April and then again on October 1 with the ballistic missile attacks on Israel. And the issue is those ballistic missile attacks and even the drones from Lebanon, as we saw just last weekend when they hit Prime Minister Netanyahu's house, they are capable of overwhelming the defenses of the Israelis. And in order to counter them, the Israelis need the Americans. And the Americans have set red lines for the Israelis. And the dominant,
What are the red lines? What are the red lines?
The most important red line is don't strike Iran. And now they know that after Iran struck Israel on October 1, they know the Israelis are going to strike Iran. And so they're trying to narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down. But from the beginning of this conflict until now, the Americans have shielded Iran completely. They don't criticize Iran in this conflict. They criticize Netanyahu every other day. They don't criticize Iran, and they don't attack Iran. They don't even attack Iran when Americans are killed. We had 3 Americans killed in Jordan. We've had many Americans wounded by Iranian proxies operating under the control of Tehran, and we don't hit Iran. Iranian proxy, the Houthis attack American ships directly. We don't attack Iran. We don't even attack Iranians in Yemen. They're under a shield of protection. So the unstated Biden doctrine is Iran is allowed to attack any country at once, either directly or through its proxies, with ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles, but no country is allowed to attack Iran in response. Now, it's the red line has shifted a little bit. The Israelis are going to attack Iran, but the administration is trying to shut down the war entirely. So I agree with the tenor of your statements in saying that the balance of power has shifted significantly in favor of the Israelis, but they're not having a good time. There's a lot of there's a lot of pressure that they have to deal with.
I have a question now for you. As a Moroccan, Muslim, Arab, I'm now traveling around.
She's a Berber.
Yeah, that's right. It's a Berber. Sorry, Berber. So I'm now traveling basically every month to the Middle East, mostly the Gulf countries, but also, Maghreb. And not with the cameras, but if I have a meeting with leaders, with sheikhs in the Gulf
But the
countries.
cameras are on.
Let me.
Cameras anyway.
No, this is going directly to Tehran. Don't worry. We are well paid. Then we will donate to Hudson. Don't worry. Anyway, so if you have a meeting one-on-one with national security advisors, I got a few meetings like that with sheikhs, ruling families. Everybody tells you, we don't do Hamas, we don't do Hezbollah. We just want, Israel to do it swiftly, hopefully in some fashionable manner, because it's getting ugly, especially in Gaza. But basically, we as Arab leaders just go to hell with all the terrorists. Openly, Prime Minister Mabdouli and Kassauna from Jordan, when I was in Riyadh, it was very open, World Economic Forum. First sentence, when we got meeting about Middle East, first sentence, they say, 7 October never shall happen. It was a huge mistake and grave error, and refugees back, and etc., and hostages back. But still, do you see it this way, that basically Palestinian question, when it's distilled to Hamas, Hezbollah, proxies, that it doesn't resonate with Arab leaders anymore?
I think so. I think that one of Iran's biggest political achievements was to. So I think there were a lot of reports basically saying that Hamas had nothing to do with Iran when it came to coordinating the mission, etc. However, it was interesting to me how the Islamic Republic of Iran was capable at that very moment to seize the opportunity to revive the Palestinian question. Why? Because it helped them stop the normalization that was happening between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That was one big political gain. The second political gain was to empower all of the militias. There was this trend with Donald Trump that, there is a Sunni coalition that is capable of collaborating with Israel against Iran. And so they gave birth to the Abraham Accords and so on, all of the normalization processes. There was also a lot of agreements between Turkey and Israel, Azerbaijan and Israel. I mean, now there's still Azerbaijan and Israel. But this is, I think, something that Iran did very cleverly. And it's not forget the costs of Iran's mobilization of the Houthis, of Hamas and Hezbollah. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes and failures of the Biden administration, apart from Afghanistan, is the Red Sea. The Red Sea is blocked. It's 1 trillion worth of goods, and it has not. And for Saudis and the UAE, it's a big disaster. Let's not forget too that Sudan now is in a civil war. Iran is taking advantage of it with all the UAVs. So they are very aware of the danger, the imminent danger of having Iran so empowered by the Palestinian question. And as Mike said, it's also the United States' inability to see that.
I will go on. So it's more still, it's a power game, let's say, Iran as the country, as the regime against other countries in the region, or is there some religious aspect, Shia, Sunni? Is this important now in the Middle East?
I think it is. I think it 100% is. And just that what the Islamic Republic of Iran does very cleverly is to go to the most radical Sunni factions that are dissatisfied with, for example, Saudi Arabia and UAE, etc. For example, Saudi Arabia, they're now focused on the Saudi Vision 2030. They want to modernize. They want to have access. They are doing all of these reforms for women, etc. So they are playing on that to appeal to these most radical factions that that have as an ambition to overthrow the regimes. So yeah, I think it's true that there is a deep mistrust in the Sunni Shia world, but the Islamic Republic knows how to appeal to the most radical ones.
If there is some aspect Shia Sunni, where does it leave Qatar?
I think Qatar is kind of condemned by geography. They have to deal with Iran, and they have to do whatever it takes to appease them. Even though there is an American base that I visited actually, and it was clear for them that they actually will do whatever it takes and whatever the United States tells them to do, so that they can maintain this relationship with Iran, so that it remains friendly, but at the same time, they are a non-major NATO ally. So I think for the Qataris, it's a different, situation.
So if 5-6 years ago, Qatar was very smelly. Nobody in the region wanted to, nobody wanted to talk to him. There was barrage, there was embargo, it was nothing. Now we see it here from Czech Republic. Czech-Qatari relations are stellar. We have embassy there, they have embassy here. President Pavel was there, Prime Minister. It's like kiss, kiss, hug, hug. The same now, Al-Thani family visiting Mar-a-Lago, I think even. So basically meeting Trump like this. So is there some strategic shift? Yes, I understand there is a geography, there is a Shia Sunni, there is Al Jazeera and so on. There is Hamas guy somewhere in the bunker, in Doha. So, but is there a shift?
A shift in which way? That
towards, towards the West?
I think there is. I think what they are trying to do actually is to diversify their partners. They understood through the embargo that they can't rely on.
So embargo was the trigger.
Yeah, I think so. And so they need to have different partners. That's why they're building this immense infrastructure and supply, and they're working on their supply chains and so on. Either it's pharmaceutical sector or agricultural sector. They are very aware of food security issues, so they are diversifying as much as they can. And I think the embargo, where the United States for 2 minutes hesitated of what to do, I think that hesitation marked them. And they are going to double down on maintaining as much Western support as they can.
Got it. Questions? Guys, wake up.
While they're waiting to talk, I'll just add one thing to that. The Turks. The Qataris went to the Turks. There are two countries in the Middle East that are capable of standing up to the Iranians militarily, and that's the Israelis and the Turks. And the Turks, the Israelis are in a competition with the Iranians, a military competition with the Iranians. The Turks are not. But wherever Turks are, Iranians are not. The Turks are not in a competition with them. If there was a competition, the Turks would win it, hands down. They don't feel the need to be in a competition with them. But the Qatar.
Now you need to comment.
One of the oldest borders between two countries in the world is the Turkish-Iranian border, which has not changed an inch since 1683. Prior to that, we both learned through the hard way, through lots of violence, not to mess with each other. Historically, it was always a competition. So there's always this balance that both sides try to respect. But my question is, as we are also discussing U.S. elections, what would be the difference of a possible Kamala Harris presidency or Donald Trump presidency in the relations with Middle East? Would any one of them try to win Iran over? I've always argued, instead of placing all these sanctions, the West should try to open more McDonald's and Hollywood movies in Tehran to really win their young population, because they want to be a part of it. But is there any attempt, or do you think will there be any attempt to somehow bring them to the playground.
There are two views in Washington. There's the right view and your view. Your view is really the Democrat view, which is that the key to stabilizing the Middle East is to reach a strategic accommodation with Iran. And that's what Obama, that's what Biden, and that's what Kamala Harris will try to do. And that's why they have shielded Iran from an Israeli attack. And it's why they've shielded from an American attack as well. Because they want to they see themselves as a mediator between the American alliance system, in particular the Gulf countries and Israel and the Iranians. Turkey is a little bit outside of this because of what you mentioned, that there is this long historical competition and a rules of the game that the two have established. If the United States comes to Ankara and says, will you help us put pressure on the Iranians, the Turks are going to say no. They don't want to be part of that game.
Depends on what kind of pressure.
Yeah, limited pressure in certain ways. If we were smarter, I would say if we were smarter, but President Erdogan went to Baku and read a poem.
I need to drink. When you are talking poems, I need to drink.
He read a poem and it made the Iranians start crying from fear. So there's a way that if we understood the Turkish-Iranian relationship in depth, then we could actually use the Turks effectively against the Iranians. But we don't understand it, and we make the Turks nervous when we come and start talking about Iran. But the Biden administration wants to appease Iran. The Obama team wanted to appease Iran, and Iran pockets every concession that we make, and then it used through its proxies, it attacks all of our allies. So the right approach really is to establish military deterrence against the Iranians, and that is we have to pose a credible. When I say we, the Israeli and the Israelis is really what we're talking about. Together, it doesn't matter who does what, but we have to pose a credible military threat to the Iranians, so that they understand when they attack international shipping through the Houthis, they will lose something in Iran. This is how countries have conducted international politics from Thucydides until yesterday. For some reason, the sophisticated American mind has decided that if we make concessions to the Iranians and tell them that we love them and that we want to get along with them, that somehow that this will lead to peace and stability. And I'm glad you're laughing because that is actually how they think.
I could just add, when I first started at Hudson under Michael Duran's, I still am, he gave me this article that I read called Obama's Secret Strategy, where he basically...
This is my article. She's doing propaganda for me.
No, but it's really...
Get a pay rise.
No, it's true.
This gentleman's already bored, no, I know.
It completely opened my eyes because it's counterintuitive to think of how well the Iranians play. As you know, for example, there's these latest elections with this reformist president, and all of a sudden there's going to be an opening, and Democrats use that so that they push for more regional integration of Iran, and there's no regional integration because in Islamic Republic DNA they are in a struggle against the West. So I just highlighted that.
Can I just I want any analysis of the Middle East that starts with a binary like extremists, moderates, Sunnis, Shiites, whatever, I think it gets it wrong. I really do. The essential, if there's a bilateral contest going on, it's Russia, China, Iran, but especially Iran, versus the American alliance system. That's the game that's going on. And all of these countries, like in America today, it's very hard to find anybody who will say something nice about the Qataris.
Especially on the Hill.
Yeah, especially on the Hill. Yeah. Because the Qataris are the devil of the day, and but I think it's a complete mistake. If the United States has a policy that offers a credible military threat to the Iranians, and everyone in the region understands that. Even if the Saudis and the Emiratis understand it, if the Israelis understand it, if the Turks understand it, then everyone will shift their positions, and they will stop hedging toward Iran, toward China, toward Russia. They'll hedge somewhat. They always will. It's inevitable that there's going to be a hedge. But everybody in the region, their their policy is X minus something, and X is our policy. So if our policy is to get really tough on Iran, then and that's X, then Israel is going to be X. If that's the case, that the Emiratis are going to be X minus 1 or 2, because look at the geography, as Zainab said, the Qataris, the Emiratis, they're halfway to Tehran already. They're vulnerable. One missile from Tehran could destroy the Emirati economy. So they're always going to hedge somewhat, but they're going to, if we pull the whole system this way, the system will move this way toward us. The key factor is to get the Iran policy right. If the Iran policy is right, I won't say that the Middle East will be beautiful and quiet and everything, but it'll be a lot more stable and a lot easier to deal with. It's the same thing in this part of the world. If we have the right Ukraine policy, you're going to be a lot more comfortable.
Sure.
A lot, right. If we have the wrong Ukraine policy, you're going to start hedging like hell.
True. Question for you, maybe also for Luke as a military guy. So Gaza is in rubble, especially northern Gaza, 70% of buildings, down, destroyed. Now we see what's happening in northern front, Lebanon. What do you think that Israeli military strategy will be in next few weeks? Will it be weeks? Will it be months? So what's the next steps and what's the end game?
The Israelis are, right now at the highest levels of the Israeli government, there's a debate, and there's two sides to the debate. One side says we have to pursue this until the end.
Who's who? Bibi is this? This is
Well,
Bibi.
probably. I actually don't. I know I have very good evidence for what I'm saying, very good sources for what I'm saying. I don't know who's on what,
Okay.
but Bibi probably is. But he's also pretty good at like Trump. He likes to. But the reason I say it like that, the wild card is the hostages.
Yeah.
So you might, if there was a deal on the cards right now, on the table right now, to get all of the hostages back, the Israelis would say accept a ceasefire. I think.
Got it.
Right. So that's the wild card. But there's one team that's saying we have to continue until the end. What is the end? The end is ending the rocket and missile fire from Lebanon, right, and deterring the Iranians. And maybe the end is even destroying the Iranian nuclear position. But we have to go a lot further. The other side is saying, no, we've done enough for the moment, that this rocket and missile fire is impossible to suppress, like physically impossible to suppress. We do not have the capability to do it. So what we should do is we should be looking for a ceasefire now, and then start recouping, right? So that's but if we look just at Gaza, forget about Lebanon, but just at Gaza, the job, as the Israelis understand it, is only half done in Gaza, because they have defeated Hamas as a terrorist army capable of threatening the surrounding population, but Hamas still dominates Gaza politically, and it will dominate Gaza politically as long as it controls all of the aid. It controls all of the international aid coming in. So the Americans are saying to the Israelis, you have to let all of this aid in, right? And we want to stop the war right now. That gives Hamas hope that if it holds out longer, American pressure will stop the war and it'll allow Hamas to regroup. The Israelis are not going to allow it to regroup. They're not. There's going to be a process. I don't know how they're going to do it, and it may be a process of trial and elimination. But they're going to separate the delivery of aid from Hamas. That's the key next step in the war.
Will Israel retaliate against Iran
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it.
soon?
I keep predicting like 3 days from now. I made that prediction about 7 times and it keeps not happening. My prediction now is Saturday night. Okay, it's not 3 days from now.
Question about people. Now, what I saw personally, it's many years ago, but still, I was many times in Zatari camp, the Jordan-Syrian border. I was in Sabra el-Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. I don't blame Israel because 10 years ago, I asked Lebanese government, why the hell this kind of suffering in your capital city? But still, suffering is suffering. So people are suffering. People are suffering in Gaza. People are suffering in Lebanon. Is there any hope? And I'm not saying political hope, but maybe economic hope that basically these people will be let go to Egypt or they will have normal life in Lebanon because, guys here. So in Lebanon there are more than 70 jobs that refugees cannot do. So basically, they on purpose radicalize them. So what will happen to these people? It's 2-3 million of them. What's
Look, there is no Lebanon. It doesn't exist. In the sense of, I'm talking about a Lebanese state that Israel or the United States can cut a deal with and that can deliver on the deal.
Yeah.
If the deal has anything to do with security, because security is totally under the control of Hezbollah and Iran. So all of the Lebanese are very good at drawing us all into these negotiations about the contours of their government right now and so forth. But in the end, it doesn't matter because the deal is between Iran, Hezbollah, and Israel, and us. So we will cast the deal in terms of a deal between Lebanon and Israel, like the maritime border agreement and so on. But really, the security of Lebanon is in the hands of Iran. That's the truth. And what the average Lebanese, I see. I mean, there are Lebanese all over Washington D.C. Working at think tanks and elsewhere, and they're of course all in Lebanon talking about Lebanese politics and expressing their views. They have no impact on the security situation.
I will reiterate. I'm not asking about Lebanon as Lebanon, but people suffering, Palestinians in Sabra Shatila, and maybe more in Gaza. So let's put aside Hamas. Let's put aside military and a strategy. What will happen to the people?
The military dynamic is going to decide all of this. All of these questions doesn't matter what we say, how much we say it's important, how much we say we're concerned about it, and so on. There is a fundamental security dynamic that is determining the steps of the Iranians, the steps of the Israelis, and to a certain degree the steps of the United States. And that is what is going to determine what happens.
You're referring to the humanitarian situation
Yes.
and so on. I think everyone in the Arab world understands that there is basically these people are being held hostage by these terrorist groups. I mean, I just saw some videos of Hamas people shooting Palestinians. There is no, like, to prepare for a good humanitarian situation or like for a peace, the first thing to do is to eradicate these terrorists. Otherwise, the suffering will continue.
This is a common knowledge.
I think
Is there a understanding in Arab world, that without Hamas and Hezbollah, that's the first step, how to deal with humanitarian.
At the government level, yes. Popularly, no.
Iran
Don't you
is
think when civilians are being killed and all the 50,000 people died in Palestine cannot be all Hamas members? There are many, because 70% of them are women and children. So don't you think this civilian casualties is just strengthening the arguments of players like Iran, Netanyahu, and all the other radical movements, including Hezbollah and Hamas? I mean, don't you think a ceasefire is needed before we can really sit and try to find a solution?
You can't tell an Israeli that let's talk about Hezbollah. And let's move away from Gaza for a second. You can't tell an Israeli that lives on the Lebanese border, and they have just shown, the Israelis have gone into, along the border, and they have discovered the tunnels that go under the border and come up, and they show all of the weapons that were there. And we know that the Radwan forces were ready to carry out an October 7th attack on the Israelis. And we see daily the drones and missiles that are coming in across the border. There's a poll out in the major Israeli daily today, Ma'ariv, that shows that 70% of the people who've been displaced from the border, which is between 80 and 100,000 people, 70% of them say they will not go back to their homes. So any government, if the Turkish government was being shelled by the PKK out of Syria into Turkish territory, and the PKK was digging tunnels under the Turkish border into Turkey, the Turkish government would be under such pressure from the Turkish people to destroy those tunnels and to destroy the threat of the people that were sending those rockets and missiles, regardless.
Which we have.
Yes, no.
But we never bombed hospitals or schools or mosques or churches.
But we all know that under the mosques, under the hospitals, under the schools, schools are the supplies of these terrorist organizations, where they're using them as cover. We know that. People who don't like Israel will say that that is not the case, but anyone who's looked at it seriously knows that that is the case. Every Israeli knows that's the case. And so there's no way to tell them, listen, I'm sorry, because there are schools there and the terrorist facilities are under the schools, you have to accept rockets and missiles. They're not going to accept it. They're just not going to. Look, personally, I don't think they should. I don't think Turks should have to accept that from the PKK. I don't think that the Israelis should have to accept it from Hamas or Hezbollah. But regardless of my feelings, they're not going to. They're simply not going to. They're going to eradicate it. And so what the international community should be saying, instead of, this is one of what I think is terrible about the framing of the Biden administration, is that the Biden administration is saying all the time, ceasefire, Israel is killing civilians. What we should be saying is we have to get these civilians out of harm's way. The war in Gaza is the only war in human history in which we are not allowed to have refugees, right? We are not allowed, the Iranians and the Russians, the Iranians and the Russians sent millions, you know this better than anyone, they sent millions of Syrians out of Syria. Nobody said, no, all of those civilians in Syria must stay in Syria and receive the bombs of the Iranians and the Russians. But in the case of Israel, we say, no, I'm sorry, all of those civilians have to stay in Gaza. They cannot be moved anywhere else out of harm's way. This is a policy, a humanitarian policy that plays into the hands of the terrorists. It's completely immoral as far as I'm concerned. It's not the Israelis who are being immoral. The Israelis are trying to protect their own civilian population from terrorist attacks.
Mattfield.
It's a while since I've worked in the Middle East peace process, but this has reminded me how utterly depressing and tragic it is on all sides, and how hard it is to see, what are often entirely legitimate security gains, particularly for Israel, but the pursuit of them actually makes Israel less secure. So what we're looking at in terms of the generations of radicalization will follow the leadership that's been taken out. I mean, it's very hard to see that as a friend of Israel and to see how Israel's security in the medium and long term is going to be affected by all of this, because it's hard to imagine Israel is going to be safer as a result of this period. But just in terms of the possible changes that we might have in Washington, I mean, you say anything that starts with a sort of a binary definition of good guys, bad guys is unhelpful. I fear we have someone coming into the White House who tends to see things in those sorts of terms. And I'm just interested as to what that might look like in terms of a policy towards the Middle East, whether it is, maybe it will be clarity over how Iran is treated, maybe it will be even less constraints on Israel, but just any sense that either of you has on what the new White House might mean for the Middle East.
Do you want to? I have big long thoughts, but I feel like I dominated.
Few thoughts. I think the Trump team, the Republicans in general, understand that Israel is doing America's job here when it comes to going after terrorists. I mean, Hezbollah. How many Americans they've killed? Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis. I think there were several instances where the United States could have intervened, did counteroffensive measures, etc., and they did not. And Israel is paying now the price for it, and they have to do it. So there is an understanding that Israel is doing America's job. Moreover, there is the, as Mike mentioned, the nuclear part. Iran is on the verge of getting nuclear weapons, but more importantly, it is collaborating with Russia at a huge scale. Not just in terms of drones, they are going after nuclear agreements. For example, in the Sahel, in Niger, they are expanding drastically their operations. So I think because of the Republicans' whole political package that they came up with, that was actually having maximum pressure on Iran, etc., which paved the way for the Abraham Accords and normalization with Israel to happen. Well, actually, I think we'll be on steroids here, precisely because of all the geopolitical changes that happened.
I think the Trump team is going to be on a gut level more hostile to Iran because the Biden administration believes that Iran, some kind of outreach to Iran, strategic accommodation of Iran is the key to stability in the region. The Trump administration believes that Iran is the problem. And they also are more sympathetic to Israel. So I think the chance of Trump stabilizing the Middle East or the Middle East will never be perfectly stable. There's too many factors, but it'll be in a much better situation because the Biden administration has filled Iran's coffers with money. And it has given them the signal that military pressure by them, that is through their proxies, will be rewarded all around the region. All of the instability that we see, including the war in Gaza, is made in Tehran. And I think the balance will be restored significantly by Trump. I don't trust the Trump administration, or I can't give an assurance up front that they will necessarily deliver. What we need to deliver to Tehran is a sense to Khamenei that any aggression toward us or toward our allies will lead to them losing things that they hold dear. As sure as day follows night, or night follows day, that they will lose something. I'm not sure that Trump will set up the regular system like that, but his inclination will be in that direction, and that'll do a lot to stabilize the region because the region has been destabilized primarily by Iran. That's the problem. It's not Israel. It's not the right wing in Israel. It's Iran.
Any last question? Yeah.
It's historical, but maybe some would say that it's Americans who destroy the balance in the region by weakening Iraq and strengthening Iraq by in Bush administration the way they managed Iraq whatever occupation or building democracy. So you guys strengthened Iraq. So
Look how upset you made. Don't upset my colleague.
Okay, so who strengthened Iran? Right? Like that's the question. Yeah.
No, look. Can we turn off the? I worked for George W. Bush, and unfortunately, I have to say that look. I think all of the problems in the Middle East, I say they all begin with Tehran. I think they all begin with the American policy. An American policy that counters Iran properly I talked to a very well-informed Czech person today, and I said, "What do you want to see from the United States in the Middle East?" He said, "I want clarity. I want clarity. If we had clarity, then we would understand what our role is. But everything is so confused. We don't know what our role is. The job of the United States is to set the table." And to set the conditions for people's roles and missions to be clear. And I agree with you. I agree with you. Since the Iraq War, we have made the table a very confused place, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you. Thanks, my Goran. Thanks, Zina. And now, last but not least, Ukraine. And Ambassador of United Kingdom, because you are from where?
Well, no, my wife is British.
Yeah, but you are from which American state?
Missouri.
You are from Missouri. Yeah. So Luke Coffey, he worked for Department of Defense of United Kingdom. He was advisor of, you don't have Republicans, Conservative Party of United Kingdom. You were special advisor to Secretary Fox.
Yep.
A lot of stuff in Commons, a lot of testimonies in the House of Lords.
Yep.
So he's our American-British friend here. But he's also decorated Army officer, Afghanistan, Bronze Star, if I'm not mistaken, no small ship. Also,
you need to introduce me everywhere.
Yeah. So, Luke, let's talk Ukraine. By the way, Luke got big medal from President Zelensky as well, personally. So, Luke.
Those third class.
Yeah, but still, it's not first class still. But medal from Zelensky is also not small. So, okay, 2.5 years of the war, a lot of money being spent. There is more or less stalemate. Yes, Russians are moving step by step, 3 kilometers a day here, 5 kilometers there. Russians are building 4 new army corps. Mm-hmm. A lot of weapons being assembled somewhere in, Siberia. Now winter is upon us, elections in 2.5 weeks. Putin is waiting. Harris administration versus Trump administration, what will happen?
Right. Well, thank you for hosting us. Thanks for everyone who stuck around for the graveyard session here. Look, I'm not optimistic, or I'm not going to try to spin some sort of positivity on either candidate. I think both will be probably pretty bad for Ukraine, but for different reasons. For reasons that my colleague and friend Peter had already alluded to, but maybe I could flesh out a little bit with some more detail. If Kamala Harris wins, we'll probably see a continuation of the current policy of the Biden administration, which is doing just enough to make it look like something is being done without actually doing what is required to ensure that Ukraine can win on the battlefield. Meanwhile, with President Trump, I fear that he may try to force a deal onto Ukraine that they don't want to accept, but they feel like they have to because, let's say, the U.S. stops with this aid and assistance, which would probably bring an end to the fighting for a few years. But history tells us that in 5 to 10 years, Russia will be back bigger than ever, ready to finish the job. Ironically, both probably would prefer a negotiated outcome, a negotiated settlement to the conflict. So overall, I am not optimistic about what the prospects will be for Ukraine after the election. Had it been, Nikki Haley, perhaps things would be different, but it's not. We have to operate in the world we are in, not in the world we want to be in, and unfortunately, that's where we are.
What will happen in the battlefield? Let's say whoever will be president is president sitting, so we are February, so March, Rasputica, so the muddy season. Yeah. So in April, probably Putin will use those 4 new army corps, North Korean, whoever knows, and he will try to push.
10 days supply of cannon and butcher.
Exactly.
10 days.
Yeah, but what do you think will happen?
We're definitely into the hypothetical here because there's so many different variables that are at play, especially with who not only wins the White House, but also who controls both houses of Congress. So it's difficult to say, but in general terms, I will say that from my experience, regularly meeting with Ukrainians, visiting Ukraine, they are not going to stop fighting if the United States stops providing assistance. It'll be bloodier for them. It'll be more difficult for them, but they truly see what they're experiencing as being an existential threat. So I don't foresee in the short term Ukrainians ceasing hostilities or stopping the fighting. I think they will probably become more desperate and continue with what they see as a necessary struggle. I think one of the reasons why we saw the entry into Kursk Oblast was as a way to, there are a few reasons why they went into Kursk. One was to kind of hedge their bets on the outcome in November, because right now the front lines cannot be frozen where they are, because if they were frozen, that would mean Ukraine would be in control of about 600 square kilometers of Russian territory. Also, it helped change the narrative of the war. You mentioned the perceived stalemate. Going into Kursk, capturing thousands of prisoners and taking control of Suja gas terminal, having indirect fire control over major road networks and railway networks in Kursk Oblast, and showing that the Ukrainians could take the offensive, change the strategic narrative and dialogue, at least for several weeks in the West. It certainly did in America, where people were surprised by what Ukraine did. And on this point, I think it's an important observation that the fact that the Ukrainian military was able to keep this operation a secret in this day and age of prolific social media shows the high level of discipline that the armed forces have. And anyone who served in the military knows that if you want to have that level of discipline, you have to have high levels of morale. So I don't think we should discount the Ukrainian will to fight, mainly because they feel like they have no other choice.
Got it. Okay. Now both, not defense, but the stability of the system. So as an economist, I see that Elvira Nabiulina, central banker in Moscow, German Gref as a main banker, they are able to keep going for at least a year or two. After that, it's going to be more difficult, but they are doing a really great job. On the Ukrainian side, now money from Brussels voted for the big bill, thanks Donald Trump for letting it pass.
Yeah.
But still, what's the stability of the system, of the engine in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, firstly, undoubtedly, the Russians are facing economic challenges, but the problem we have is people were expecting like rapid economic decline in Russia, not understanding or appreciating how resilient or how prepared the Russians were for this eventuality. And this is why from the very beginning of the large-scale invasion, I was writing and saying in my publications that this war will be measured in years, not weeks, not months, but years. And this is why we have to take a more long-term approach, especially in terms of how our economic sanctions will impact Russia. In terms of the resiliency of ongoing Western support and in particular U.S. support, there are a couple of points to make here. Firstly, the U.S. has given actually very little in relative terms to Ukraine. As measured as a percentage of GDP, the United States ranks 30th in the world, behind the economic geopolitical powerhouses of Ireland, Austria, Malta, all of which have, as a percentage of GDP, have given more aid to Ukraine. So far, the United States has authorized, not given, but the Congress has authorized about 180 billion US dollars over the course of 2.5 years of this war. During the same period of 2.5 years, this amount represents less than 0.2% of America's GDP. So I tell my American colleagues and friends and my family, imagine over this same period of time, the US GDP is represented by a $1 bill. Take 100 pennies, take one of those pennies, cut that penny into 10 pieces, then take 2 of those pieces. Over the past 2.5 years, that's how much we've given to Ukraine. And this idea that we can't afford to do this, or there's no political will to do this because, the common argument you hear is Americans are tired of the forever wars. Yeah. This is also nonsense, right? The idea that Americans are so tired of Iraq and Afghanistan that we can't just support Ukraine with weapons is a very inside the beltway, elite-driven argument. The reality is 99.5% of Americans never served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Not to minimize the cost of life or limb, because I lost friends, family members, and colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan, but 0.04% of the American population were wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan, and 0.004% of the American population was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. During the past 20 years, the U.S. military was at war. The U.S. nation was not at war. So there is no fatigue. If we wanted to support Ukraine with economic assistance, military assistance, we can do this. It's a matter of having the political will to do so.
It's problem will on the hill, and I read some data from Pew from September. Basically, the nation is moving like politics is pendulum to this isolationist state. So basically, it's not worthy for guys on Capitol Hill, just basically to do this.
Well, what we do know is that every Republican and Democrat that voted for Ukrainian aid over the past 2.5 years have been safe in their seats in terms of primaries and elections. Yes. So this has not become an electoral issue at the grassroots level. Also, there has been a lack of leadership at the very top, explaining to the American people why what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Europe matters to Americans. Americans want to be led on foreign policy. They want to be explained. They want to have explained to them. They want to be led on these issues. And when you don't have this leadership, it creates a communications vacuum that's filled by people like Tucker Carlson and the like.
So it's problem of marketing, basically.
It is. So President Biden, for example, on the rare occasion that he will talk about why Ukraine is important, he tells the American people that we have to spend billions of dollars for Ukraine in order to preserve something called the international rules-based order. Okay, my family from rural Missouri have no idea what the hell that is. Wait, and when they hear that something like this exists,
It's something from hell.
they're immediately suspicious of it, right? They're like, whoa, we have an international rules-based order? No, we don't want
This
that.
is
We don't want that in
deep
Missouri.
state. This is deep state.
Very globalist. But instead, let's talk about the economics of Europe, okay? Maybe Asia is the future. I don't know. Doubt it. But right now, what I do know is half of the world's economy is found between North America and Europe. What I do know is that 2/3 of all foreign investment that comes into the United States comes from this continent. What I do know is that 48 out of 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China. 48 out of 50. And when an American is building a product or when an American is providing a service to be exported, that is an American job. And right now, Vladimir Putin is trying to undermine the stability in Europe, which has led to the economic prosperity here, which not only benefits the U.S. economy, but also the American worker. And if you're from the heartland, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, and you're a laborer, you work in a factory, the fruits of your labor are 4 or 5 times more likely to go to Europe than they are to Asia. So this is why Europe matters. When I go out of the Beltway, when I go across the United States and I explain why does Europe matter, why does Ukraine matter, I forget all the nonsense about international rules-based order. I forget, and this actually makes me sad to say, but I also skip over the whole, these are people fighting for self-determination, these are people fighting for freedom and fighting for liberty, because for whatever reason, and it's probably an indicator of how sad our society is right now, but for whatever reason, these arguments don't resonate with Americans anymore. But what does resonate is that job, that factory job, manufacturing job, providing a product, providing a service that's being exported to America's largest export market, which is Europe. This is the argument that works the best.
What will happen to, let's say, American military leadership? Bases, NATO, showing power outside. What will happen?
Under
whoever.
Well,
projecting power outside.
So one of the last acts, one of the last big policy decisions taken by the Trump administration was the announcement that 10,000 U.S. troops would be leaving Europe. Or actually, about 4,000 were going to be relocated out of Germany.
To Romania?
To the Netherlands and to Italy. And then 6,000 or so were going to be brought back to the United States. And that was purely based off, President Trump's displeasure with Germany. Biden came in and he canceled that. But in 2014, I used to say, in 2014, 10,000 U.S. troops were moving west back to the United States from Germany. 10,000 British troops were moving west from Germany back to the UK. And tens of thousands of Russian troops were moving west into Ukraine, all in that same year. That was one of the last acts of the Trump administration, and of course, Obama administration was very much guilty of that as well. But this idea that there's all this spare capacity in the U.S. armed forces here in Europe or other regions of the world, and we have to, take this spare capacity and move it to the Indo-Pacific is also nonsense when you look at the numbers. Already, 90% of the U.S. ground force is based in the United States. Already, 2/3 of our Navy is permanently assigned to the Indo-Pacific. So this idea that we just have so many spare forces kicking around in Europe and we have to move them to Asia, it just doesn't meet with the actual reality of the numbers. So I think it's very, very important for the U.S. to keep its military presence in Europe, purely because it's in America's national interests. I mean, our U.S. military presence here in Europe is here first and foremost about U.S. national interests. I hate to say it, but that's the reality.
It's a fair point. It's a fair point.
The defense of Europe is a consequence of, but not the reason for, the U.S. military presence here. And we have to think of it like this.
And national interest is jobs and export? What's the national interest?
The national interest is in this interdependent, globalized, smaller world that the U.S. has forces forward base in order to not only protect our allies, which is important, but to give U.S. policymakers options to respond quickly to different crises around the world. So I was based in Italy for.
So it's about bases.
Bases, yeah. The Cold War garrisons in Europe are now the forward operating bases of the 21st century for the United States. I was based in Italy for 4 years. I never once trained on a mission to defend the Brenner Pass. I was trained to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I hope that regardless of who is president, we see the value in having these forward position U.S. forces, which not only serve U.S. national interests, but also serve the interests of our allies and our partners.
Mark Rutte, now new Secretary General, 14 years Prime Minister, I think 14.
Yeah.
Not a single time, 2% GDP on defense.
Yeah.
What will happen to him under Trump?
I think he's a very astute statesman, and he'll probably follow the lead of his predecessor and get along just fine with Trump. I think he'll know what to say, what to do. That's not a problem. But the point you make earlier about coming from the Netherlands, coming from a country that hadn't spent 2% until like this year. And I'm not a
When he's not prime minister.
I'm not an expert, but I would guess there was some creative accountancy that probably took place to get to that number. I felt like it should have been from Eastern Europe, the section, but that was just my preference.
Yeah. A Romanian families.
Yeah, there you go.
So, okay. If you have questions. No, please go.
Yeah, thank you for what you said previously. I think it's the right spin that to put Europe's security in the optic of US also national interest, and the presence of troops, I think it should be where the war is waged, so the Black Sea actually region.
I love the Turkey, Romania, Black Sea. I love it.
Yes, we are cooperating very well. And in Prague. Back to Ukraine now. I think we all agree with what you said, that Ukrainians are very brave, and they really fight hard and for their own sovereignty and territorial integrity. But on the other hand, I think at least the leadership feels that there will be a pressure for a kind of deal, or at least a ceasefire. And I think this victory plan of Zelensky is also part of preparing such a deal for next year, perhaps. Part of this plan is the idea of security guarantee for Ukraine. How do you see this? What is feasible? Because they need something, and it's important to package any deal in a way that we will not leave the Russians with the feeling that they won. Because if we do that, we will create a very bad precedent.
Absolutely. No, I agree. This is a very difficult issue. I do believe that the only realistic way for future security guarantees for Ukraine has to be through NATO, has to be through that multilateral format. The idea that the United States Senate, which has to ratify all treaties, would ratify a bilateral security treaty with Ukraine without Europe and NATO not also doing it is a non-starter. So I think that NATO is the way forward. Now, what are the circumstances of this? Ultimately, this has to be up to the Ukrainians to decide. You hear a lot of things being talked about. Let's freeze where the front lines are now, and everything under the control of the central government of Kyiv would be under Article 5. Everything not would de facto be under Russian control. So I'm going to bore everyone here. So if you want to leave, go ahead, because it's about to get very technical. But back in 2018, I think it was, I wrote this very detailed paper on how Georgia could enter NATO with part of their territory under occupation. Now, Georgia today looks a lot different from what it did back then, so bear me out. But basically, my argument was that all of Georgia would be invited to join NATO. That only the regions not under Russian occupation would have the Article 5 commitment. This would work for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's a precedent for countries being inside NATO but not having all of their territory under Article 5 control or protection. The USA is the greatest example. Hawaii, Guam, Marshall Islands, all the Pacific Islands that are US possessions are not covered under Article 5. Falkland Islands for the British, Reunion for the French, because Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty states where Article 5 applies, and Article 6 states in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. Right? So you'd have to amend Article 6 to specify which parts of Ukraine or Georgia would be covered. This also has been done twice. 1952, when Turkey and Greece joined NATO, Article 6 was amended. And in the 1960s, when French Algeria became independent, then the article was amended again because NATO was actually extending the Article 5 protection to French Algeria. Also, but all right, so that's how it could work. And during the accessions protocol process, you would amend Article 6 to define where exactly Article 5 would be applicable. However, this only works in the case of Georgia and wouldn't work right now in the case of Ukraine, because since 2008, the UNM Saakashvili government and the Georgian Dream Ivanishvili government both adopted a non-use of force pledge to get the occupied territories back. So if you have a non-use of force pledge to get the occupied regions back, then you don't need an Article 5 commitment, presumably, for those territories. We're not at that place right now in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not going to declare a unilateral non-use of force pledge. Maybe someday they will choose to. This is completely up to the Ukrainians. But until the Ukrainians pursue this route, I would find it very difficult to see a pathway for them to enter NATO. In my opinion, the most direct way to get Ukraine into NATO is to give them the weapons they need to win on the battlefield as quickly as possible, and then we can get them into the alliance.
Last question, or anyone else question? Okay, Jan Machach, and then I will have a closing question.
Okay, so apparently every country, including yours, needs a deeper discussion about what national interests are and more enlightenment. But if I would quote your colleague, my favorite colleague from Hudson Institute, Walter Russell, like, if I remember it well, he wrote that the main national interest of the US to keep naval routes open globally. It's number one, according to him. So which probably has to do a little more with Pacific in Europe. So what's your take on this?
Well, I would go back to, firstly, I would say that America is a superpower that has lots of means. If it wants to keep Europe stable and secure and also keep global shipping open, it can do both. Again, Europe and North America are half of the global economy. So this idea that, it doesn't matter, it just, doesn't add up in terms of the economics of it. So defense spending, national security spending, diplomatic spending, like all public spending, is about establishing national priorities. So we as a nation have to establish the right national priorities to ensure that our interests are protected. And luckily, for many of our allies and our partners, our interests more often than not, coincide with the interests of our allies and partners around the world.
My closing question is actually not about Ukraine. Recently, American...
Then I'm not answering.
No. It's purely military. So American Enterprise Institute published a study several weeks ago about difference between official Chinese military budget and real one. And it's like triple. Because if we count official budgets only, it's America and nobody else.
Yeah.
But this paper is showing quite pathway that Chinese not overcome US, but they will be calling the shots, at least in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
What's your thinking on it?
So I had a question.
Please.
Yeah, of course.
What would be the difference of a possible Trump presidency or Harris presidency for China?
Okay.
Any difference at all?
I'm calling for reinforcements from my house. No. All right. So on your point, Jan, a few observations to make. Firstly, believe it or not, first, I don't dispute that China's probably spending a lot more on defense and national security than their official figures suggest. I mean, there's nothing in recent years that leads me to believe that the CCP is being transparent and open with accounting.
And probably unlike Netherlands, it's not a creative accounting, it's real one.
It's real accounting, yeah, for sure. But I will also say that I think it's time we update how we measure defense spending and national security spending here in NATO. You can go to the NATO website and see what we still use to measure the 2% mark. We measure, for example, pensions and ministries of defense, civilian pensions and MODs, for example. That can go towards a country's 2%. I mean, imagine that, right? We're having trouble reaching 2%, and we're including civil service pensions in the Ministry of Defense. This is why Greece is so high on the rankings, right?
So no tanks, but a lot of pensions.
But no, so it hasn't been updated. So cybersecurity resiliency, countering hybrid warfare and misinformation, issues that have a direct link to a nation's security, but are interdepartmental, interministerial issues are not included in this 2%. Maybe it's time we update this and we have a better idea on how to gauge where we are relative to China. But of course, the same is probably to be said with Russia, Iran, these countries. They're probably investing and spending a lot more on their national security architecture than what we really know. In terms of China, I am not, this is another area where I'm not overly optimistic for a number of reasons. And I should preface this by saying I'm not an Asia expert, so maybe I'm talking complete nonsense up here on this. But with Trump, some of his rhetoric on Taiwan has been concerning, suggesting that, well, it's only important because of semiconductors and, the U.S. may not come to its assistance or defense. And then on China, when it comes to China, you've really heard nothing of substance from Harris. So I actually have no idea what her views are on this matter. But I will say, an observation I have of American society when it comes to China is that there is a disconnect between what your average American thinks about China and what the national security elite think about China. Undoubtedly, across America, there is widespread discontent, unhappiness, dislike, almost hatred for China. But on the grassroots side, your average American dislikes China because the idea that they're stealing our jobs and intellectual property, or that they covered up the COVID virus. And that turned my world upside down for 2 years. I lost family members. I lost my job. Had all this uncertainty. My kids weren't educated. I have, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. The 10-year-old, we're having to do private tutoring for phonics for properly reading and speaking because as a kindergartner, as a 5-year-old, he's doing phonics over Zoom with a teacher still wearing a face mask. Right, so there's a pent-up animosity towards China because of this reason, but then the elites talk about the reason why China is a threat to us because semiconductor production in Taiwan, which most Americans have no idea what the hell a semiconductor is, or we have to protect something called the first island chain, which again most people are like, well, what the hell is the first island chain, and why is it important? And I just find it very hard to believe that American families will be ready to send sons and daughters to the South China Sea to defend something called the first island chain. And this goes back to my earlier point about how our leaders communicate, or in the case of Ukraine or Taiwan, fail to communicate why these issues really matter. So with China, with Trump, he'll try to play a tough game with China. I don't know if he sees it more as a trade imbalance issue as opposed to a geopolitical struggle. And Kamala Harris, I have literally no idea what her policy or views are on China.